Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single episode and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Good afternoon, everybody. Got to keep the energy level up in a nice hot tent. So good afternoon to all. I'm Michael Neiberg. I work at the U.S. Army War College. I'm delighted to be on this panel with...
Peter Pomerantsev. I'm an author. I write about propaganda, and I work at Johns Hopkins University in Washington.
As it turns out, we only live about 2 hours apart from each other, and we had to come all the way to Wiltshire to meet.
It's more like 3.5.
It depends on the traffic. It
Plus,
could well
Amtrak
be
is really bad, and so give it 5 hours.
Yeah, it could be 5 hours, it could be 2. What we're going to do today, Peter has written this really terrific book, looking at really two wars in one, looking at the British efforts both to counter German propaganda and to develop a bit of its own in the Second World War, and what that historical experience tells us about the current war in Ukraine and vice versa. So what we're going to do is Peter's going to talk a little bit about the book itself for about 10 minutes and the central character of the book, the central figure of the book, I should say, not character, that was a real person. We'll interact a little bit, and then we'll throw it open to you all for about the last 20 minutes. And then we'll get you out of this warm tent into dinner and to a Spitfire flyover. So, Peter, with that, the floor is yours.
Sure. So this is my third book. My first two were about nasty contemporary propaganda and disinformation today. I'll probably use the term propaganda right now in the sense of some sort of malign manipulation. I wrote a book about Putin's propaganda. Then I did a round the world book looking at China, the Middle East, the USA. And then I discovered this largely forgotten story from the Second World War, where in a very good cause, to fight Nazi propaganda, to subvert the power of Hitler's propaganda inside Germany and inside Europe, we, the British, developed what one might call fake news. We developed an army of covert radio stations that were broadcasting into Nazi Germany, into occupied France, Italy, and beyond, essentially false flag radios, which pretended to be genuine Nazi stations, genuine German stations, genuine Italian stations, but kind of mixed a Nazi mask with information and disinformation that subverted people's belief in Hitler and his cronies. So one station, a very famous one, called Gustav Siegfried I, was hosted by a furious far-right German soldier, spewing vitriol and a lot of pornography aimed at the Nazi officials, accusing them of indulging in these corrupt orgies while good German soldiers were dying on the front. They were using rare bits of butter to smear themselves and their harlots and harlot boys, and lots of helmets with spiked bits on top for these spectacular orgies, eating up rare foodstuffs which were unavailable to ordinary Germans, talking about how German soldiers were being mistreated and starved on the front by their corrupt superiors, talking about how the Luftwaffe was full of secret commies that weren't protecting the homeland enough, how we should bomb the British even more, etc., etc., etc. So this kind of fake news program that was aimed at subverting faith in Nazi officials, but from a kind of far-right position. And, as I discovered this story, as I unearthed, with the help of remarkable archivists, the transcripts of these radio shows, I was just fascinated by this project because it was a chance to learn how propaganda works, but when we did it. And it raised all sorts of complicated moral questions about how much do you become like the other side when you fight them. So that's how I started researching this subject, and I became fascinated by the guy who ran it, Sefton Delmer, who had an identity a bit similar to mine. I probably sound very English, but I'm actually from Ukraine originally. He sounded very German. He grew up in Germany, but was English. So he had this dual identity, and he claimed to understand the German psyche very well. So that's how I started discovering this story. And there was dozens of radio stations that we ran this way. And then there was kind of a moment when the whole story kind of flipped around for me, which is when it transpired that from 1943, Sefton Delmer, who was a very subtle psychologist, he actually wasn't trying to convince the Germans that these were real Nazi stations. So he writes about this in his memoirs, and the other people who worked on this project wrote about it as well. He wanted the Germans to understand that this was actually the British cosplaying the Nazis. Yeah? So you were meant to understand that these were the British pretending to be Nazis. And at that point, I was like, what's going on here? Because that's not what the Russians are doing. When they do fake news Twitter handles in the US, Americans are meant to believe it's Americans. And he was doing something much more sophisticated. He wanted to do this firstly. He wanted to give Germans a safe space to kind of express their resentment of the Nazis. So if the Gestapo were to discover you, you could go, oh, I thought it was a real Nazi station, sir. Secondly, he was giving them a safe psychological space. He talked about this a lot. He'd understood that when people listen to criticism of their own country, you had to do this from a point of view of our boys, us Germans. Lecturing at them the way the German service of the BBC did wouldn't work. You had to almost express their resentments through the language they felt comfortable in, even though they knew this was the British doing it. And in doing so, I think he was doing something even more subtle. He was saying, look, if we, the British, can put on a mask and play at being Nazis, if we can understand your frustrations so well we sound genuine, then maybe we understand you better than Hitler and his propaganda. And he was creating this gap, this emotional gap between the German people and Nazi propaganda. And once I discovered that, that's when I realized I want to write a book about it, because that was something that I'd never heard about before.
And so the key takeaway for me from that is this program works because he knew Germany. He knew its psychology. He knew the way it worked. It didn't seem rough. It didn't seem like some of the propaganda that we get from Russia seems obviously, okay, this is clearly somebody that doesn't know the United States, but others of it has been incredibly subtle and incredibly well understood. So you have two books in one here. So I guess what I want to ask you as an author reading your book, I was really impressed by the way you're taking two stories and bringing them together and weaving them together. So I have to ask you, which of these stories, I'm assuming it's the Sefton Delmer story that came to you first, or did you right away see when you were looking at this and say, this is not just a story of the past, this is a story of the present as well? Did that hit you right away, or did that evolve as you were working on this project?
So you're quite right. So the book is 80% Sefton Delmer's work to subvert Nazi propaganda, and 20% the war in Ukraine, how do we fight Russian propaganda, some asides about some propaganda issues we see in America as well. I study propaganda today, disinformation today. I always looked at Delmer's story from the point of view, what can we learn from it? However, once I'd started the writing, is when I was actually like halfway through, Putin launched his full-scale invasion. And the two stories kind of emotionally merged. Yeah? The intensity merged. And the horrific war crimes that Russia is committing in Ukraine gave a strong enough parallel to the Second World War. It's the largest, war in Europe since the Second World War. So it became more legitimate to make some of these parallels. But no, it was always going to be, what can we learn from Delmer today? That was always my position. I'm not a historian. I feel a little bit overawed at a historian's festival.
I think we're going to let you into the club for the duration of today. It's
good. I've got 45 minutes as a historian.
Yeah, that's right. No. And you worked in archives, which is kind of the way that we do things. That's the kind of litmus test for us. But you talked too about the way that propaganda works best I think the phrase you use, when it fills an empty space, right? So can you talk a little bit about that? What do you think is the empty space that Delmer, you alluded to it a little bit, was trying to exploit in Germany? And what do you think it is that Putin's people are really trying to exploit in the West today? What is the central empty space they're going for?
Yeah. So in this sense, I think we see very, historical patterns. The sort of propaganda that we're talking about, a propaganda that builds a sense of community and very aggressive identity and superiority, seems to be particularly successful at times of massive social, economic, technological change. When people don't know who they are, when society is ruptured, when old forms of life and old social identities, including gender identities, are subverted, then in that chaos, a certain type of propaganda emerges that recreates communal identity, but along very, very aggressive lines, the German people, true Russians, true Americans, that simplifies your personal identity so that you know who you are in a confusing world. You are the superior Aryan who is superior to the Untermenschen, the sub-people of Nazi Germany. You are the pure Russian who is superior to the bastardized, decadent Ukrainians who don't know who they are anymore because they've been seduced by LGBT propaganda, etc., etc. So this sort of propaganda fills in a void. And Delmer had a deeply theatrical view of human nature, which I think comes from him moving around countries so much as a child. He learned to play different social roles as a kid. He learned to see a kind of, to put it simpler, in today's social media world, where we see people performing themselves online, performing their political identities online, Delmer would have instantly recognized that. He saw the Nazis as this sort of gruesome cabaret that filled in people's lack of solid identity in 1920s and 1930s Germany. And it's an identity that allowed you to express and normalize your most vile feelings, that told you who you were, and that made you feel superior to others. And if you wanted to disrupt that, you have to understand those bonds, and you have to crawl inside that very toxic role that the Nazis had given people and start to disrupt it. And that's what he was trying to do.
And I think the other thing you do in this book, it's tempting when you're writing a book that features one person to either sort of demonize that person or lionize that person. And you were quite careful to say, this is a brilliant man who's figured out a lot of stuff and figured out a great system, but he was really kind of an awful person. I mean, he wasn't universally liked or loved, we can say gently. And you bring out the character of this very complex person who really, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, until the rise of the Nazis, probably identified himself as much German as anything else, even if his family had come from Britain. So can you talk just a little bit about him, the person, and is this the kind of thing that only a person like him could have done in the 1930s? This strange, odd person that is shaped by a very unusual upbringing.
So I felt actually an instant bond as I read about his early life. So I kind of want to defend him as you said those things. Like, hey, no, he is complicated, but hold on. I think that I'll give you one anecdote from his life that made me want to write about him more. So he grows up in World War I Germany. He's the son of a British academic who's teaching at Berlin University, and he's bullied as the only English boy at school during the First World War. Yeah, he's going to a German gymnasium in 1914. He's 10 years old. He's beaten up. He's picked on. He's humiliated. And then he says something incredibly honest, how at the same time he's defending, the honor of Britain in the school playground. And yet when everybody starts singing the German military songs, when they have these moments of kind of communal war propaganda ecstasy in school and they're marching and they're singing, he gets caught up in the singing. And he finds himself singing along. And he's sort of wondering, hold on, who's the real me? Is it the English me? Or is it the me caught up in this orgiastic propaganda, which obviously anticipates Nazi propaganda? So he's wonderfully honest about how easy it is for any of us to be caught up in propaganda. Yeah. So that, I think, is already a huge thing to say. He's not lecturing to Germans, oh, you naughty Germans who dare to be seduced by Hitler. He's saying any one of us can be seduced by propaganda. And then he comes back to England in 1917, so he's 13, And he's finally home. He's never lived in England. He comes home and everybody in London laughs at him because he's dressed like a little German schoolboy in the wrong type of socks. He's wearing the wrong type of socks. He's wearing German socks, not long English knee-high pull-up socks. And they're all laughing at him. He goes to an English school, but he speaks with a slight German accent. The way he pronounces his Latin is the way Germans do Latin. I mean, he gets quite subtle. He can't play cricket. And so he's laughed at for being too German after having been laughed at for being too English. So he's got this this split identity, doesn't fit in anywhere, then goes back to Germany in the 1920s. And kind of to make up for the fact he doesn't belong anywhere, he becomes a master of disguise. So he becomes probably the most famous English journalist covering the rise of the Nazis. He works for the Daily Express, which in those days is a really big deal. That's hard for us to imagine now, but then it was like really, really, really important. And he's the star reporter of the rise of the Nazis. And he pioneers a style of journalism which is part Tintin and part Borat. He basically puts on these disguises to penetrate into a Nazi rally. On a different project, he pretends to be a kind of a loudmouth German going around English hotels to see if the English have forgiven the Germans for the First World War. He basically does a Borat thing where he goes around English provincial hotels saying, "Hello, I am the German, World War I, we should have won, huh?" And sees how the English react and does these social experiments where he dresses up as a character. So disguise, cabaret, acting roles becomes his kind of modus operandi and becomes what he's famous for as a journalist. And when it comes to the Second World War, what he's essentially saying is that I can dive into Germans' inner psychology. Only I can kind of put on this mask and become German and then mess with their psychology from inside. So could it only have been him? Yes. Yeah. And in that sense, I think he did something absolutely unique.
I think so too, yeah. And I think the Borat analogy is a great one. This kind of instigator to get a reaction is absolutely right. Before we sort of run out of time and turn it over to the audience, there are a couple other aspects of this I do want to talk to you about.
We have 28 minutes. We're good.
Oh, we have 20 minutes, then it goes. I thought it was 20 minutes for the whole thing.
No,
we can talk forever. I did want to talk about the technological aspect that's going on in both cases, because you remark on this. Delmar's only able to do what he's able to do because there's this new medium of radio that allows them to kind of beam over the Nazi propaganda. And of course, Putin today has weaponized social media, has weaponized the media in ways that I don't think the West has ever really as yet figured out a response to. So can you talk a little bit about the ways that maybe the person or the system meets the technology? And maybe we'll start with Delmar. I mean, he clearly had an appreciation of what radio could do. He clearly had an appreciation that this was a way to almost create that kind of Borat theatrical way, and it couldn't be blocked. It couldn't be stopped. So can you talk a bit about that?
Well, listen, if we look at the story of radio in the early 20th century and social media today, it's a very similar arc. So when radio appears at the start of the 20th century, there's all these very romantic notions that it will end all wars, because people will be able to hear each other across borders and they'll understand each other and there will be perpetual peace. Very soon afterwards, Hitler and then Stalin work out that you can use radio for the exact opposite, and you could use it to instigate hate and to create a community. So one of the first things that the Nazis do when they get into power is to create a little Volksempfänger, a cheap radio that they put into every German home. Well, not every, I think like 2/3 of Germans have a radio, the highest amount in Europe. And Hitler is brought into your living room. He's not just in Nuremberg, he's in your living room creating the Volksgemeinschaft, creating the community of the people. And very much social media today, peddlers of hate use social media to create these kind of often conspiratorial online communities, and to sort of place people in what we sometimes call echo chambers. So very similar kind of hope to do with social media first, very hopey changey, very vague, quickly weaponized by a propaganda of hate and an authoritarian propaganda. And then you have this moment of people like Delmer going, hold on, can we actually weaponize this back? What can we do back? How do we crawl into these communities and start messing with them from inside? Look, Delmer's doing this obviously at a moment of existential danger for Britain, and he's given a green light to do this. His criticism is very familiar to what we hear today. So he's very critical of what we might call liberal media. Yeah, he's very critical of German exile media, which is very romantic, trying to preach socialism and democracy to Germans who are besotted with Hitler. He's very critical of the BBC German service, which he says is just German emigres talking to each other. Maida Vale talking to Hampstead is how he describes it. And he's saying, no, we've got to crawl into those people's worlds. That's not something that we've started to do. Yeah. However, in the book, I do talk about Ukrainians who are fighting an existential war. They're starting to do campaigns into Russia, which have a note of the Delmer to them, trying to penetrate within Russian society, trying to understand the motivations of Russian soldiers. They've understood that telling Russian soldiers don't commit war crimes doesn't work. But telling Russian soldiers that, your families aren't going to be paid the money they were promised by the government once you're dead, or why don't you defect and survive instead of dying for Putin's mad dreams, telling them that sort of thing is much more effective. But they're going on a journey that kind of, we went on during the Second World War. Yeah. They don't have the resources that we had, so maybe we should empower them, because for them it is existential.
Yeah, this is reminds me, there was an incident in the U.S., this thing called the Jade Helm event, where the Texas National Guard was being mobilized. It was a regular training schedule in the Obama years that they did. The Russians understood the United States enough that they started flooding social media with these stories that this was an Obama plot to take guns away. And it worked, because somebody in this Russian propaganda system knew the United States and knew where to push those buttons. So I wanted to talk to you about that too, because when I talk to folks about this, or when I hear people talk about this, they say that the West begins from a sort of a disadvantage, because our society is so open. It's easy enough for somebody on the other side of a curtain to figure out where those fault lines are, to figure out where to push. Whereas doing it the other way, trying to do what Delmar did into Russia and China, is actually incredibly difficult. Would you agree with that? And here the Ukrainians have an advantage because they know the Russians certainly better than anybody else does. Is this something that you think can only be done by Ukrainians, or does the Delmar story maybe suggest something else?
No, so Delmer, he was operating out of Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire, but he was working with a team of hundreds of people, Germany experts, loads of exiles from Germany, but who understood his approach. So loads of stars from the German cabaret scene. One of the delicious bits of the story is that he's creating these stations full of Nazi characters that were often played by German Jews, so who were kind of putting on the mask of their torturers to subvert them.
I love that.
I love that detail.
Yeah, it was just beautiful. Yeah.
So he surrounded himself with exiled Germans, but the ones who got it, the ones who were prepared to not just preach at the Germans and tell them how naughty they were, but were prepared to actually start messing with Nazi psychology. And then tremendous experts on psychiatry, on history, on the sort of the lives of soldiers, lots of POWs. So no, you need people who understand that world. But look, Delmer's content was based on a huge amount of research. So even though he was, let's be honest, definitely playing with disinformation at times, which I do not approve of, he was doing that because sometimes he didn't have enough information to give German audiences. Yeah. He was actually doing a huge amount of research about what life was like for the regular German. He was, for example, getting transcripts of what German POWs in Britain were telling each other. So the British put microphones in POW camps and recorded everything that German POWs talked about. That was done largely for military intelligence, but then they would give it to Delmer, who would read it and find out the latest jokes that people were saying, the latest rumors, the latest slang. He was obsessed with getting the language right. That's number one. Number two, he was getting partisans inside occupied Europe to tell him the tiny details of life inside, Germans stationed in France. The scores of the local football matches, between German military teams. Which VD was being given from which brothel to which soldiers. Which corrupt officer was buying himself a car that was way too nice for his salary. What the food was like for ordinary soldiers. Like the tiny details of life, so that he could talk about this detail. So German soldiers could go, oh my God, we know this is the British cosplaying Nazis, but they know more about our lives than our superiors. So this huge information gathering operation. Today, that is much more easy to do through, I don't know, there seems to be a lot of hacks of communication between, Russian military officials at all sorts of levels. We can do scraping of online media to understand what people are saying to each other. You don't need to recruit partisans. You just create secure online spaces where people can start telling you the latest, the latest gossip from an environment. So it's much easier to do that information gathering. It was much harder for Delmer, but you've got to do it. So I actually think it's much easier to do what he did then. Still very hard operating in closed societies, but it's much easier than it was in the Second World War. We just haven't set our minds to it. We haven't really gone down a path of really trying to affect the behavior of Russian military, of their family, let alone the wider society. I think we should.
Your point about language reminded me, I got a briefing in Helsinki once where they said that Russian misinformation does not work in Finland because the Russians haven't figured out a way to translate anything into Finnish because it's such an impossibly hard language, so that they can easily tell because there's subtle clues in the language that it's somebody that doesn't understand the language. And they're actually worried that as artificial intelligence gets better, this is going to be harder for them. So I'm going to take back my characterization of Delmer and say he was argumentative and difficult. Would that be closer?
He was brilliant and always held his ground.
There you go. We'll go with that. There's another aspect to your book that I was really struck by, and I want to make sure we do have a chance to talk about it. Propaganda can of course backfire. His backfired in a really interesting way that he was very angry with in the post-war period, and I know you know what I'm talking about, but he is in part indirectly and without wanting to responsible for this myth of the good German that arises at the end of the war and after. Can you talk a little bit about how that comes about and what lesson from that do you get? And I guess the real challenge is when you're in an existential crisis like Ukraine is in, you really can't think about the post-war period very much. You've got to deal with what you're dealing with. My Army friends would say you've got to shoot the 6-meter target before you hit the 30-meter target. But yet this happened to Delmer and he was very upset about it. So would you talk about that a little bit?
So the interesting thing about Delmer is he frames his whole memoirs as a kind of morality tale about, the cool things that he did in the war, which he celebrates. But then at the end goes, but there were unintended consequences which were awful. And that's the thing about Delmer. He is himself constantly questioning his own morality. Yeah. At the start of his memoirs, he goes, am I a goody-goody or a baddie-baddie? So he's always playing on this himself, which makes him fascinating. So as I mentioned at the start, if there's one vector in his radio stations, of which there were many, it was to create a split between the German army and Nazi officials, really play on this difference. And after the war, Delmer felt that had created a kind of an excuse for senior members of the German military to sneak back into power and to say, look, we were the good Wehrmacht. We were always against Hitler. Look at our, attempted coup against him later on in the war. We never believed in the Nazi stuff. You can trust us. Let us lead industry, government, etc. And Delmer is appalled to see, all these high Wehrmacht brass come back into power. And after the war, he goes back to being a journalist at the Daily Express, and he becomes kind of the leader of a group of critics who say that Germany might again slide into dictatorship because all these old authoritarian figures and authoritarian habits are coming back.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair to him, he'd seen that happen between World War I and World War II. He'd been because he knew the Nazis so well in the 20s and 30s, he's one of the earliest to start screaming, these guys are going to lead Europe into war. Yeah? Nobody listens to him. So he feels that it's happening again. And again, to be fair for him, there was that risk in the sense that a lot of former Nazis were making their way back. It wasn't discussed. This was sort of censored in polite cultural circles. And it's only in the 60s where there's a kind of a moment of self-analysis in Germany and a moment of kind of really dealing with the past. And when he sees that happening in Germany in the 60s, because his career stretches on, then he calms down. Then he actually says, I do actually think Germany has now overcome its authoritarian tendencies. So I mean, in retrospect, he sounds hysterical. You know, he basically says, you know, is Hitler really dead? Is a very famous article of his. Not that Hitler isn't dead, but, you know, is Hitlerism really dead?
Right.
So he can sound, you know, somebody who's traumatized by history, but I think he was actually, in a very tabloid way, raising very legitimate concerns. And again, once he sees Germany dealing with these issues in the 60s, then he says, okay, the past is over now. Yeah. But he feels it was partly his fault. Of course, as he does that, he's sort of complimenting himself because he's sort of saying, my radios were so effective that they caused this crisis. So, you know, there's always a few levels with Delmer.
All right, we got a few minutes before we turn it over, so I'm going to go lightning round with you. Anne Applebaum, the journalist for The Atlantic, very popular figure based in Poland now. The three of us are going to be in the same bookstore together here in a few weeks, which is really weird to think about. She argued in an article in The Atlantic that propaganda really is working in the West because there is a decline in faith in the concept of democracy. Do you think that she's right, that if you can rebuild the West's faith in its own governance, this space for Putin and the Russians to move into will shrink?
So Anne is a really close colleague of mine. We're currently recording a podcast series together about the retreat of democracy in America. So obviously I agree with her on very, very fundamental questions. We're colleagues and collaborators. I feel as if I should disagree with her, like just because
You don't have to.
We're so class. I think, look, the skilled propagandists will always find a way. You know, they'll always find a way. But at present, it is very, very easy to make inroads into America, especially because there is this moment of you know, incredible low self-confidence on all sides of the spectrum. And the overall argument that Russia and China keeps on repeating is that, you know, democracy is dysfunctional in the start of the 21st century. Some of it is deeply manipulative, but some of the argument is fundamental. You know, and let's look at the fundamental argument, the one that might have some truth to it in a very scary way. Did you see the 100-year celebration of the Chinese Communist Party?
I did not.
I did, because I study propaganda and I have to. And it was this massive festival showing these great scenes from Chinese communist history, all done in this kind of like mass theater, these mass scenes of Mao's triumph and Xi Jinping's wonderfulness. And right at the end, when they're looking to the future, this huge figure 5 descends from the sky and everybody kind of prays to it. And I was like, what the hell is this? I thought, is this the 5-year plan? Is this like, you know, the celebration of communist ideology? And then I realized it's 5G. Huh. They're basically saying that Chinese mastery of information technology, of the internet, of AI, is going to introduce an era where China and its approach to society, which is still totalitarian at some very, very deep level, is going to win. And the argument they're making is a serious argument that in an era of big data, when there is so much information out there, only centralized control can guide society. So surrender your privacy, give us your data, and we will decide the best city for you. They're designing smart cities. We will define the best policies for you, the best society for you, we will define the best job for you, because we'll know so much about you, we'll tell you what you should be doing. It's a very strong argument. And they go, look at America. They can't deal with the amount of information out there. Look at the chaos. They can't make collaborative decisions anymore because they're so divided, so polarized. They're making bad decisions. That is a fundamental argument. That is a really big, serious argument. They're basically saying the time for centralized control has come thanks to advances in technology.
And they're exporting this technology to states that are, and dictators and authoritarian regimes that are buying it.
They're saying it's a model.
It's the way the world is coming.
Now, the scary thing is there are people in Silicon Valley who lean that way as well. Yeah. Peter Thiel, a very famous figure in Silicon Valley, one of the founders of lots of tech companies and a kind of a guru of Silicon Valley. If you read his books, and he writes books of sorts, The central argument is that in so much information, you've got to centralize it. He doesn't say centralized government control.
Right.
He says we need monopolies. We need mega companies to essentially guide society. The comforting thing, it's not very comforting, is that we had exactly the same argument in the 20s, yeah? Where a lot of big thinkers, Walter Lippmann was one, the main kind of thinker of American society in the 1920s, saying society cannot deal with the chaos brought in by radio. Radio is way too crazy. Newspapers are way too out of control. There's too much information out there. Democracy can't deal with it. We need a technocratic elite to guide society. Democracy cannot deal with this much information, disinformation, and data. And obviously you have the dictators going, it is time for centralized control. So we've kind of come back to the arguments we had in the 1920s. And, well, there's lots of lessons, good and bad, to learn from that process.
So I'm going to ask you one last question.
I've got 8 minutes and 54 seconds.
All right, I'll ask you two last questions. All right, I'll start with the second to last question, then I'll ask you the last one, if we're going to, because we do have a little bit of time, but I want to make sure our audience gets plenty of time.
You haven't asked if the Delmer's radios worked. I hate that question, so leave that to last.
Okay. Well, maybe I won't ask it. I want to ask this question.
I have an answer for it.
I want to ask this question. I have a friend of mine in New York City who is himself Ukrainian, very anti-Putin, very anti-Russian. I was with him right around the time of the invasion. The Russians had already invaded Ukraine. He was of the view that Putin was going to the Russians were going to make a little kind of circle through Ukraine and then back out. This was not going to be anything purposeful or meaningful. And I asked him, he was clearly anti-Russian, clearly hated Putin. And I said to him, well, why do you think that's the case? And he said, because the Americans have biolabs in Ukraine. Right. So my question to you is really twofold. The first is, how did someone anti-Putin, clearly pro-Ukrainian, born in Kyiv, fall to this clearly ludicrous piece of propaganda? And more importantly, when I found myself absolutely dumbfounded into a response, what should have been my answer? And the reason I asked the question is, I think if Sefton Delmer were here, he would say the answer to the question is not to say you're wrong. There would have been a better way to answer. So, go.
So, at my work at university, what I do is actually try to understand audiences and why they believe in propaganda. And actually, it's funny you mentioned the story. For those who don't know, a big Russian propaganda line before the full-scale invasion was that the Americans are building deadly biolabs in Ukraine, and that's an excuse to invade. So we actually did polling and focus groups exactly on this question. Why do people in Western Ukraine, that's people who really hate Russia, believe some of this stuff? And it was very interesting in the focus groups. We'd ask them this question. Another piece of Russian propaganda is that, the West secretly controls Ukraine's government, and, these kind of conspiratorial lines about Western meddling and secret control of Ukraine. And these were very anti-Putin people, very anti-Russian people, very patriotic, and they believe some of this stuff. And we asked why, and they'd say things like, look, I'm sort of simplifying here, because obviously they didn't use this kind of language, but the essence was, some of this stuff might be true or not. It sounds as if it might be Russian, but all our history, countries have messed with us. Yeah? Austro-Hungarian Empire, Soviet Empire, the Nazis, everybody's always trying to control us. In our personal lives, since the end of the Soviet Union, we've had banks trying to manipulate us through a lot of kind of pyramid schemes in the 90s. People lost a lot of money. We feel we have so little control over our lives. So the idea that there's secret powers doing secret things, that feels right to us. That feels right. And often conspiratorial beliefs correlate with a sense of a lack of agency, which in some countries, especially in areas like Central Europe, which have been fucked over by everybody over and over and over again, where there are secret deals between the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany done over your head. When you have a personal history of being exploited by horrible oligarchic, kind of democracy, but it wasn't really in the 1990s, the idea that there's weird powers manipulating you sounds normal. So that sense of a lack of agency and conspiratorial beliefs, that correlates a lot.
So what should I have said other than, come on?
No. So look, I have, come on.
Come on.
So there's two things. Either change the subject and talk about football.
Yeah.
There's a great anecdote I'll get to if we have time, about two people who many people here will know of how they got along. But my technique always is, you can't bang your head against it because it's got to do with identity. So what Delmer would have said, that this is a belief that comes from a sense of the self.
Yeah.
So you can't, if you start attacking your wrong, it's not about the knowledge, it's about you're attacking the person, and obviously they're going to push back. I always do the following. I go, well, how did this start? When did you start believing in this stuff? And then people start telling you a very personal story. I live in America. I'll ask it to a lot of people that I know who believe in some of the really intense right-wing propaganda. And I go, well, when did this start? And you often find a story of vulnerability. Yeah. So in Ukraine, I don't know about your friend, everybody's different, frankly. But what we found with these people was that they started talking about how they'd been exploited all their lives in very real ways, and very real ways. And you started to understand where that belief might come from. With Americans, I find it fascinating, like the ones that I've talked to, and I haven't done a lot of focus groups there, I just talk to people. You often get a story about like when people stop trusting the mainstream media. And it often starts with stuff around 9/11, actually. Like, 9/11 was such a shock to some people I talk to that since then they feel they can't trust anyone. They saw the Twin Towers falling, and since then, I'm falling here, God. It's about living your language. Since then, they can't trust anyone anymore. Like, everything is uncertain. Again, not everybody went on a journey to end up believing that, Barack Obama is actually Muslim, but that's where it started from. So you've got to get to that start, and then you have a personal story, and then it becomes very human, and then you can find a conversation.
I have occasionally in similar situations just said I'm not in the habit of repeating Kremlin propaganda, and that usually begins a conversation.
Sure, whatever. That's a fun one.
But I was dumbfounded by his response because it came from someone I would never have believed would have been susceptible to this.
It's when we saw polling figures that exactly this pattern. Patriotic Ukrainians repeating the Kremlin, but it's the Kremlin being clever when they put out this propaganda. The Kremlin worked out you couldn't tell patriotic Ukrainians Putin is great. That's not going to work. Right. You've got to say, oh, the West is evil too. That's what you've got to attack.
This has actually been, I don't study propaganda like you do, but I do a lot of First World War stuff, and it's easy to see the message that a government is trying to project to people. It's a lot harder to understand. Nobody writes in their memoirs, oh, I saw a piece of propaganda today and I changed my mind. You will occasionally see someone say, I can't believe the crap this government is trying to push on me. But it's in the absence of the kind of polling that you do, it's really difficult to understand how and why people are, in the past, are receiving this. It's easier, I think, in the present. You can look at social media clicks, how it goes viral or doesn't go viral. But I think fundamentally you're right. It has to be subtle enough that it's pushing psychologically in the right way. And that's where Delmer really is an innovator in this.
I mean, look, we're very lucky. We're very lucky historically with the story of Nazi propaganda that we have Klemperer, this incredible German Jewish academic, who obviously gets thrown out of his job very quickly when the Nazis come to power, and spends day to day recording in his diary how people are coming under the influence of Nazi propaganda, how their language is changing. He roots it in a change of language. So we do have this, what we might call qualitative analysis of what the Nazis were doing. The Nazis themselves were doing bits of polling, so we have a little bit of that as well. In my book, I reference a lot the reports of the Sicherheitsdienst of the SS. So the SS are constantly analyzing their own society to work out whether propaganda is working and failing. Then we have Goebbels' responses to that. So we can start to piece together bits of their kind of thought process. But look, it's but also on the polling, as a last thing, 46 seconds left, the British were doing polling of German POWs as they were POWing them, taking them prisoner. And they were asking, how much of Delmer's radios do you listen to? Around 40% were listening to Delmer's radios. Answer the question, was it successful? And did you trust it? So the British were doing little bits of polling as the Second World War was happening. The French, inside occupied France, as there were more and more German prisoners of war, the surveys got bigger. Very interesting surveys that were done after the the attempted coup against Hitler by Tom Cruise. By von Stauffenberg. I get confused. I'm not a historian. But after Tom Cruise and von Stauffenberg did their coup, really interesting polling of German POWs, and this was mass polling. This was already thousands, I think. It's in the book if you want the exact numbers.
We're flashing.
And what was interesting, after the coup fails, amazing uplift in patriotism and pro-Hitler sentiment among German POWs, which is why, we often get asked, why don't we just kill Putin? Because if you fail, the upswing in support for the victim who survived is going to be huge.
And it's not immediately clear that the replacement will be better, and a failed state...
I think it's going to be better than Hitler, come on.
And Hitler, yes, I'm thinking Putin. And a failed state in Russia is not really what we want, necessarily. So I want to thank Peter. This is one of those rare books that is really important to understanding the past and incredibly important to understanding an absolutely existential issue in our present. So he's going to the Waterstones tent. I strongly encourage you to follow him. Peter, I hope we run into each other in the United States.
We will. We're meeting in Pennsylvania.
Back to Europe.
Meeting in Pennsylvania. Okay.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.